Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Tamai, for that introduction and for coordinating this opportunity. And I really want to give a thanks to the Diversity Mavens unit for the work that you're doing in really encouraging a rich conversation. There's something pretty special happening in the medical community as it relates to conversations of race that is not really happening even in the legal community, in the education community. They're almost slow to jump into it. You know, this conversation of critical race theory, of analyzing stories and things, started from the legal field. It was with Professor Derek Bell back in the 70s, and it jumped off into the medical community, into the educational realm. But it's the medical community who's actually done something about it, besides some really rich research. And so I'm very excited to be part of this series and this conversation here on North Campus. Happy Black History Month. It's one of my favorite times of the year. For those of you who attended the brunch, I shared the Black History Month brunch that Africana Study does. I shared with you that my son came to me and he said, "Hey Mom, what's your favorite holiday?" And I said, "Well, I'm gonna go with Christmas and Black History Month." He said, "Me too." I said, "That's not true. I know you like your birthday. You put a lot of work into it." We start talking about it 6 months in advance. But it is true. I earnestly love this time. And I'm very disappointed when I hear people say we don't need this pausing time in America to reflect on and study and look at the Black American story as it relates to the development of this nation. There's almost no older story in this nation than the Black American story. There's no other people that were written into the Constitution. There's almost no other people whose economic labor was the foundation for the entire economy in this nation. It is a unique story that has not been touched the world over. And I believe it's important to still pause and do it, because if we don't pause, no one else will. So I thought about that. Since it is Black History Month, you know, this is really the time when people get together and we'll pause and do things. And I could share with you my family's history and heritage. I've become a real fan of those Ancestry.com commercials. I mean, they're just getting better and better. And I'm like, forget this job, I'm just gonna go research my ancestors, you know? And there's actually big money in it, so there's always an economy, there's always an economic opportunity somewhere. But I could share with you my family's cultural heritage. I mean, that's one of the big components of Ancestry.com, is being able to study your ancestry. And it's pretty awesome to think about where you journeyed from, particularly if you're from the United States, what that looks like, how each state has a different custom and culture. If you come from an international family, it becomes very, very exciting, because you get to study where your family was, what customs came over to this nation, and what it looks like. And so I thought about that. And other people have started to expand this notion of what your family's legacy is. Some people will do an ancestry journey, but basically study their family's spiritual ancestry. What kind of religious practices have we done? What kind of spiritual beliefs have been passed on from generation to generation? And that can be very interesting for people in that realm. And another type of ancestral search I encourage each of you to do is your family's work history. What they've done to pay the bills, to stay alive, to survive, what work ethic has been passed down from generation to generation. And it's really, really a rich kind of thing to do. You know, it starts to paint a very different picture of your family story than what you'll hear kind of put in big quotes and numbers. And so I debated coming with a bunch of stats about the status of things, and I've got all that information. And I debated coming with all the negative things that are also in the story, and I've got all that too. But there's something rich in the oral history tradition of families' work history. For instance, my great-grandfather, born and raised in northern Louisiana, the youngest of 15 children. His father would die shortly after he was born. His mother would therefore be raising the 15 children on her own for quite a few years. Was, by all documented stories, a sharecropper. That's what it said when he filled out the paperwork. That's when they asked him if he could read or not, if he could read and write. You know, the story they wrote down was field laborer. That's what the census records showed me. That's what I would then put into my genealogy chart. That was his story. But that wasn't the full story. I didn't realize the full story until I talked to my grandmother. And I said, well, you know, your father was a sharecropper. Can you tell me more about what he did and how it works? She's like, well, yeah, he was a sharecropper. That's what he did. But he was also our town's molasses man. I was like, oh. Does anybody know about a molasses man, what their responsibility is, what their role was? I was joking with my students. We've got crack now, but back in the day, before there was crack, there was sugar, which was the original version. You guys are all medical people, you already know that, but basically the world, I can't imagine what it was like pre-sugar. I don't know how they got anything done. And then sugar was introduced, and it changed everything. And how we get it and work with it, and if anyone comes from communities where sugar cane is available and there's nothing sweeter than to chop a sugar cane right out of the field and crack it open and just take it in. But then from there, that was an expensive product to create. So for many poor communities, molasses would serve as the substitute for sugar and sugar cane products. But it wasn't easy to do. It wasn't just me in my backyard. And so many communities would have a molasses man who would be the one who would produce it in the community. And as I'm talking to my grandmother about this, she's like, yeah. She said my dad would bottle it, and he would create labels, and he had multiple variations of it. And all of a sudden, the picture of my great-grandfather changed from sharecropper who worked Mr. Charlie's field, that was actually his name, Mr. Charlie, but the sharecropper who worked Mr. Charlie's field to an entrepreneur. Well, that's a whole different story. That's a whole different legacy. So when my father developed an entrepreneurial spirit and when my sister had an entrepreneurial spirit, it didn't just rise up because they were educated. It didn't just rise up because they went to a college somewhere that explained it. It was always there in the family's history. And so I encourage you, when you study your family, I encourage you to slow down and ask the questions, because of all things that we all know, the opportunity to ask the questions to the people who can answer it goes so quickly. The people who know the stories are often no longer with us. And so I encourage you to train your children in the next generation to go back and ask the questions, ask the stories. What was it like? What kind of toys did you play with? What kind of things did you do? And so when I think about this idea of a work history and my great-grandfather, it really causes me to pause and reflect on what kind of work did I learn from my female ancestors? What kind of story did they have? Now, like I said, my great-grandfather raised in northern Louisiana. My grandmother would be therefore the daughter of sharecroppers. Both my great-grandmother and my great-grandfather were sharecroppers. My great-grandmother, Idell Bankhead, her mother, or maybe I believe her grandmother, was the plantation cook. And so she was basically the herb woman. If you needed anything, she had it in a pocket. Good herbs and the not so good herbs, depending on what the issue was and who you needed to tell a story about. But she was so when I think about why my grandmother was such a good cook, we were little, northern Jersey kids, and we always called her grandma, and we always forgot to say ma'am, and she didn't mind because she knew we were the northern grandkids, which shows how much she loved us. And I would say, man, you're such a good cook. You should open up a restaurant. She'd just laugh and laugh. But I had not known the story that 3 generations before, her ancestors were the ones who set the cooking standard. Thought that was pretty exciting. So to go from being the plantation cook to sharecroppers to my grandmother branching out of sharecropping, she would still do it. She would still pick cotton, and she would describe to me walking down the 3 rows of cotton and her ability to pick all 3 at the same time. Mostly people just would work the 1 row of cotton, and my dad would tell stories of going to help Mama pick cotton, and he said that was hard. We didn't do that again. It's not just those cotton commercials. They tricked us all, right? It's supposed to be these fluffy cotton balls. That's not cotton. Cotton is evil. Cotton is like those stickers here in New Mexico. It hurts. Your hands are rough. Everything about you is impacted by this product that you've got to pull. And she would pull, I think, 2 75-pound bags, just go in all those rows because she had 5 children to support. So in the seasons, she would pick cotton. She would do a number of things, but the primary job she would hold would be a domestic worker. And so that's, how many of you saw the film The Help and watched that representation? I always encourage people, read the book. The book's much better. The film had too many levels of things that couldn't be understood, and that it's hard to translate into film a richer story. The author actually did a really nice job in the written text. But you should be aware that the author is a white woman who had a very different perspective about the help. And so there are little things that I think are often overlooked because And we'll play with that in a minute. But that's my grandmother. She would be a domestic worker whose entire plan was for her daughters to never do what she did. So here she is in the segregated South, 1921, still picking cotton by the 60s. And she had an oldest daughter who would be the only child for a number of years. And my aunt told me stories that the people my grandmother would go clean for would say, hey, why don't you bring your daughter along? I have a friend who's looking for someone young. And she would say, no, not my daughter. My daughter will not be doing any of this. She is not the one you're looking for. She's got a different thing she's going to be doing. And so neither of my aunts would be trained in domestic work because my grandmother wanted it made very clear to them, you are meant to do something very different in the next generation. That would lead to my father being the third of my grandmother's 5 children, who would, at the right time, in the right place, and the right blessings, would go on to, at this point, be on his way to have earned 4 graduate degrees, 4 advanced degrees. A very different trajectory, because my grandmother really wanted this different path. That was my paternal family work history as it relates to the females. My maternal family is a Black Panamanian family, which is a very different thing. This gets into the immigrant experience of the Black community that is not often translated and understood. My great-grandmother would leave Jamaica to go to Panama to work on the canal. Now, she wasn't actually in the canal, but she would be one of the women that would follow with the men to translate from the West Indies to Panama, and would then, therefore, be Panamanian, and would raise 10 children in Panama who are all born there. So my family celebrates a West Indian and Panamanian heritage made up of Cubanos and Jamaicans in that community. And from there, my great-grandmother, it's not clear if she worked as a domestic or if she worked somehow in the area, but my grandmother in Panama would work in the canal zone, but at the same time would have also an entrepreneurial spirit. She had a mango plantation, and she would make everyone go out and pick mangoes at the right season, at the right time, and was always looking for new opportunities. And of course, one of the big opportunities that will come in the 60s, once immigration laws change, is to leave Panama and come to the United States. Many people don't understand the immigrant experience. There's always this quick perception of a group of people rushing across a border trying to pop out a baby. Am I right? I mean, that's the general story we're given, is that's what it means to be an immigrant in America. And that's really not the truth of it at all. And particularly, most people are going to be working for 5 to 10 plus years to get their family from another country to this country using all of the mechanisms. I mean, you don't know what it means to have to plan ahead for a green card and a visa. We can barely plan ahead enough to get to the movies on time. And the visa process will require this months and months in preparation that husbands and wives will often spend multiple years apart, that children will never quite have a geographic place that is attached to their name, that there's always this responsibility to return economic resources back to the family who has so much less despite how little you think you have in the United States. It is this very, very, very transitional kind of thing that happens. And my grandmother would do that. She would leave her 5 children, my grandfather, in Panama, and would come to the United States on her own for 2 years to establish her economic start. She would also work as a domestic and would then move into subway. She collected the tokens in the subway and got robbed twice. She was always very clear about that experience. It was New York City. If anybody knows the Bronx at all, it might happen. There's something funny. My family, they're regular people until they get back in the city. And then they turn into New Yorkers. If anybody knows a good New Yorker, there's this thing that clicks. They turn their rings around, they strap their purse on differently, and everything's different. So I am always excited to visit with my New York family members. But my grandmother would have this entrepreneurial spirit, this economic push that she would do as a northern Black woman, Black Latina, in the 60s and 70s. That would be very different. So I wanted to give you guys a little bit of something. That's my family's history. I encourage you guys to go and listen to your own. And I wanted to give you a couple of things.
we rise. You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still like dust, I'll rise. Does my sassiness upset you? Why are you beset with gloom just 'cause I walk as if I have oil wells pumping in my living room? Just like suns and like moons, with the certainty of tides, just like hope springing high, still I rise. Did you want to see me broken? Bowed head and lowered eyes, shoulders falling down like teardrops, weakened by my soulful cries. Does my sassiness upset you? Don't take it so hard just 'cause I laugh. As if I have gold mines digging in my own backyard. You can shoot me with your words. You can cut me with your lies. You can kill me with your hatefulness. But just like life, I'll rise. Does my sexiness offend you? Oh, does it come as a surprise that I dance? As if I have diamonds at the meeting of my thighs. Out of the huts of history's shame I rise. Up from a past rooted in pain I rise. A black ocean leaping and wide, welling and swelling, I bear in the tide. Leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise. Into a daybreak miraculously clear, I rise. Bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave. I am the hope and the dream of the slave. And so, naturally, there I go rising.
That is Maya Angelou reciting her own work, and she does it better than any other version I've seen, of And Still I Rise. This work always makes me think of the parallels between what would be put on to black women in the workforce versus what they knew about themselves on the inside. So Tamai said, if you got anything provocative you want to throw out there, I said, well, I might have one or two things. We're going to start with, and I just want to give you some imagery because we're going to go back through history, but I want you to have some modern representations of what you'll see. And these are three images that will stem from the three major stereotype archetypes given to black women. In particular, the first one will refer to the mammy stereotype. And we'll see how that will get changed through time from a mammy stereotype to what we'll call the welfare queen stereotype and how that's been represented. Which is basically, the mammy stereotype would be this idea of an asexual black woman, that you don't have to worry about her getting sexually assaulted, because who would want to assault someone who is undefinable? But we'll talk about where that comes from and how it's kind of been portrayed and played out today. We'll also cover the ball-busting black woman, which comes from the type of Sapphire, coming from an Amos and Andy that was, it was a wife who would be very emasculating to her man. And we'll see where Michelle Obama has had to battle this angry black woman stereotype that we see today, and that often still pops up in the workforce today. And then we'll get into the Jezebel stereotype, which is the hypersexualized black woman who is unable to show any level of modesty and has a high level of immorality. So I'm going to give you a couple of images. Let's see if you can figure out who is who. And we're going to start with Medea.
She comes and reads to her every single day, every day.
All the time?
And she just got married and she's back here again. Man,
How long she stayed when she come here?
5, 6 hours, one day 8, 9 hours.
That's a lot, honey. That's a lot. Be sitting around.
My dear!
We got them things we shut them down. We got them things they look around. Daddy, look at you. looking like you.
Gee, Muggy, what you doing here? You came see me.
I didn't even know you was up in his home.
Yeah, my sister got mad at me and put me in here about 2 years ago because I did one little bitty thing.
What you do, honey?
I slept with her, man.
Hattie, at some point you got to let it go, honey. At some point you just got to give it up.
Well, that's what I did. I gave it up and I let it go. Lord, that's nice. You got on right there.
You like my
bud.
dress?
Ooh, that's nice.
This is my Coco Chanel.
That's nice.
Bam, 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 bam.
You can afford to wear that now?
No, my next door neighbor, her name Coco and her daughter named Chanel. They sew and they make these. Yeah, they sell them over there in the West End and Lee Street, right there at the corner of that MARTA station. You can go over there and pick one up right across the street from the Krispy Kreme. But don't go over there after night. Look at you.
Yeah.
Looking like you looking.
You go on waiting here. You always say the nicest things.
I'm so glad you think so. Because sometimes I look at you, Hattie, I don't know if you have a mirror or a friend.
There's a wealth of information, but I'm going to give you some imagery of Omarosa from the first season of The Apprentice. She would be the lone black female apprentice on Donald Trump's show.
That motivate, that encourage, that put. Wait, can I finish? Wow, did you see how you get towards me? Omarosa has a huge issue with power and us not accepting her ideas. With Omarosa, it's either her way or it's no way.
I made suggestions that I thought would make our team much more successful, and it was like, let's shut Omarosa up, but let's open the discussion for all of the women. Who wants to be up for nomination?
I nominate Amy. I nominate her too.
I nominate Amy. I will accept this responsibility contingent upon one thing. Both of you guys are above this bickering. This exchange is always personal.
I'm seriously shaking, and it's always been this way. Like, and I want it to stop. You are after me for whatever reason you are.
No, I'm not. I haven't
Darling,
given you any
sweetie
mental
pie, you have said so many things, and you have no idea. You have no idea.
Please. I just plead it. You guys just keep it down. Please. There'll be times when you'll want some quiet time. And they decided to get louder. They've just collectively decided, hey, let's disregard what she says.
Harry bag is back.
It's better than shave chest. I'll give it back 100 times.
The girls were talking and chatting, and I passed out. They woke me up, and they were piling out of the limo, and Omarosa was still sleeping, and I think someone had tapped her, been like, get up, and she started going nuts.
Stay out of my face.
I didn't say anything, though. For you to say that, it should require me to say something. I was passed out falling asleep. She's trying to make me her prey. She's done it to Tammy, and she's done it to me. When I'm attacked like that, I don't have anything else to do but to go back at her. Now I'm done. You threatened me. It's over. I tried so hard today to stay out of your way because of the team, not because I'm scared of you. Know that now.
I know you're scared.
Being a bitch is going to be your problem. You have to live with that for the rest of your life.
I called her a baby. I told her to go in the corner and get her a pacifier and her blanket and go cry, which is what she always does.
I am not talking to you. I am talking if you don't like it.
That is Omarosa. And, hopefully I can get it to work. This is a clip from Basketball Wives.
We're looking for animal prints. Anything short. Look at this. That's a nice dress.
I am a shopping fanatic. Make the money and spend the money. You gotta shop.
Oh, no, this isn't Basketball Wives, is it?
I gotta see.
Oh, no, this is Big Inch. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't get my... I thought I had it. Oh, man. All right, I'm sorry. I thought I had my clip. But I'm sure if you can just close your eyes and imagine Basketball Wives, you are pretty clear on what's there. The reason Omarosa becomes interesting to me is because at the end of the season, there will be Kwame, who is in the running for the top position. And basically, it gets down to Kwame and some other person, the actual winner. Kwame, as you can imagine, was an African American. And Omarosa would be put on his team. And If anybody here is old school enough, you remember that there was Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Remember Jessica Rabbit had a phrase, "I'm not bad, I'm just drawn that way." That would be Omarosa's defense. There's nothing bad about me. It's just the way that they clip the shows was constantly to show me in the most negative light. That was her argument. If you watched her in the second, when she was brought back on Celebrity Apprentice, she worked so hard. I think she's a preacher now. She worked so hard to show this new image of herself. She was like ever so conscientious of every single word and imagery that was portrayed of her because of the after effect. The Omarosa, if anybody's a good fan of the TV show 24, there was President Palmer, whose wife's name was Sheila, and Sheila was the most destructive human first lady ever designed. All of these things would be compounded when President Barack, or then Senator Barack Obama, said, "Please meet my wife, Michelle." And all of these imageries would be locked into her before she even opened her mouth. So we have imagery, basketball wives, Medea, Omarosa. And where do these archetypes start? Where do these stereotypes begin? Where did this representation begin? Would be during slavery. I encourage you to read the benchmark text in this. This is called When and Where I Enter by Paula Giddings. It's a 1984 work, and it is basically the Black woman's Bible. I mean, it tells everything about the Black female story in this nation from before, probably 100 years before it was even a nation. She goes into some of the oldest stories about Black women in America. And she gives this representation. I just wanted to tell you this picture she gives. Picture this version of America. Although Black women gained freedom after the Civil War, their capabilities were not recognized, and they were limited to the same work opportunities afforded them during slavery. Although opportunities were arising to enter college and make steps to join the professional class, the majority of Black women were still working in tobacco, rice, indigo, and cotton fields, domestic home care, and menial work. Black women would end up being barred from the industrial labor force for more than a century. And even after the century would turn, clerks and secretarial positions would still not be opened up to them once those became, quote, women work to do. There was a time when women weren't smart enough to use a typewriter. Isn't that funny how, they wouldn't have, those machines were really hard to click down. I mean, it required some, what was that, forearm strength or tricep work. But there was a time when certain professions would be barred from women. Teaching, secretarial work, clerical work. And so there, even when those positions became open, Black women would still not be opened up to them. Where does all of this start from? Well, it's all going to start from these images of Medea, Omarosa, basketball wives. These images will start back in 1643, when Black women would be defined as tithable. Anybody know what tithable means? Why that mattered in 1643? Required to pay a tithe. Now, in order to be required to pay a tithe, that means that you must be working. You must have, you're supposed to give 10%. And so Black women in 1643 would be defined differently than white women because they would be required, their work was worthy of economic counting. Now, this is where it gets kind of weird because in 1643, we have these plantation fields. We have these areas all over Georgia and South Carolina and Virginia where the mistress, the indentured white servant, and the slave would all work side by side. There was no genteel mistress in 1643. It was colonial America. It was hard enough just to stay alive. So everyone would work the field. There was no delineation of work. However, the work Black women did was worthy of being counted the same as men. They wouldn't give white women any kind of a different status, but they would start to differentiate and delineate this slanting. This is where that early racialized framing of Black Americans would come, that they're ugly, uncivilized, and unchristian. And there's a lot of fun legal history related to that. But as of 1644, it would be declared that Negro men and Negro women, all men over the age of 16 to 60, were required to pay tithes. This would be that very first step of causing division between Black and white women in America, although they were doing the same work. It would take quite a bit more time before those white women would get out of the fields, but up to that point, everyone was working side by side. So the first big role that would kind of arise once we get into the period of enslavement would be that first major picture of the mammy. And this is, it will grow out of the Negro slave on the plantation. And there were many important jobs of enslaved people on the plantations. There would be the washerwoman, the cook, the maid, the seamstress, the butler, the porter, the gardener, the coachman. All of these people would take part in moving the home life and the workforce on a plantation. But the imagery of the mammy would take on a very, very different role, because this would be, in all instances, a position of authority. The mammy would often have the ear of the master of the plantation more than his wife. This is where it gets to be very challenging. I mean, the mammy is the one who's going to know not just what the children are doing, but what is required to do to the children next. The mammy is going to have the ear of what was happening in the fields and what was happening with the house servants. The mammy was going to, in many ways, that black woman would serve as the power comparative for the white male. Now, who in this situation do you think is not pleased with this dynamic that is developing between the white male and the black female? There's a whole lot of folks. There's the white women who wanted to have the access to the same power as their spouses. It's the black men who would never be able to get to that kind of conditioning. I mean, we're not even getting into conversations of the terrorism and the sexual assault and the violence and the fear, but just in terms of what it takes to make the day work, it was this constant conversation between these two parties. The black domestic worker would be responsible for caring for the children. Her sphere of influence would increase because as she got older, you guys don't know anything about this, but sometimes when people get older, they kind of just say what they want. You guys don't know anybody like that. But often the mammy would then get an honored position on the plantation where she would have some freedom to express what's right and what's not right. And you know, this is hard. I haven't figured out an answer to this, and I'm still pondering what does this mean. But we know that in our general society, women are keepers of the culture. Or it is the women who decide how a holiday is celebrated. It is the woman who decides when meals are typically held. It is the woman who decides how we will move ourselves culturally with music and traditions and religious practices and the nuances of it. So for many times, it would be the black woman who is required to enforce the cultural traditions of the plantation. It's going to be the black woman who will have to teach the white children how to not interact with the black slaves. It will be the black woman who will have to remind people of their place and their position in moving this cogged wheel of the slave plantation. And I have yet to come to an answer of how that must have felt for these black women to have to enforce a system that was going to degrade their own children for sheer purposes of survival. Talked with my aunt, and she told me about being that only child and going with her mom to go clean houses. And she said, yeah, me and Mama would walk about 1.5 miles to get to the house. And I'd play with the little boy all day long, and Mama was just cleaning. And then it came for nap time, and I'd go to lie down next to him, and she told me I couldn't do it. She'd make me lie down on a pallet on the floor because my grandmother knew the ramifications of not enforcing those measures for survival. This would lead to a very hard place that black women would have to get to. And often when you hear these stories of great immorality, the fact that so much sexual assault was happening in these places, and we can know that because of the variety of skin colors in this space, that these were not all, or often were rarely consensual arrangements. But at some point, I have to know that my daughter will likely or might very likely be sexually assaulted. How do I still give her a different inner core to deal with what I can't stop from happening? There are mothers who would spank their children for stealing things because I know that they're going to expect you to have this kind of persona, but I've got to stop you from having it. There would be women who would be shunned for having sexual relations even when it wasn't their choice, because they had to enforce and make sure it was very clear that this is being done to us, but this is not who we are. The work I have to do involves me getting sexually assaulted in this place. It's what I have to do to survive, but it's not who we are. And so this will be a very, very hard place. This will be the very beginning of the shifting mentality that you'll hear about in Black women's literature, about these two personas you must have, that I learn when I can be Kimmy and when I must be Kimberly. Which presentation do I give in which space for which purpose? Because I'm going to have to make sure I develop the right persona to help me survive and get to the next stage after this. That mammy representation would often be very different, because she would be given this picture of being self-respecting, independent, loyal, gentle, affectionate, good and pious, quick-witted, capable and thrifty. And it wouldn't be till after slavery when it would be this quest after Reconstruction for the revival of the Old South. And they'll do a lot of things to revive the Old South. How many of you remember Newt Gingrich's statement a few years ago that if we could just get Black children to work in their schools, to be janitors in their schools, they'll see representation of work, because they live in places filled with prostitutes and pimps, so they've never seen work. That's what he said a couple of years ago. Well, that's not much different, because in 1910, there was the idea of rising up the Mammy Institute in Georgia. In fact, there are quite a few of these throughout the South. If we could just teach these Negroes how to do like the previous generation of Negroes did, then they'll learn work ethic. The more things change, the more they stay the same. These terms are still here. These conversations are still in place. The reason Newt Gingrich is wrong, I want to make sure I clarify this. He's wrong because 75% of people that receive state assistance have at least one working adult in the household. These are cheap people, you can't find 8-to-5s, because these are people that work multiple shifts. They're working a night shift or the day shift and then the backup shift after that. He is wrong because it's statistically untrue. But you can't tell Newt Gingrich statistics, so that's just another thing. So this will become a very unique thing, a very unique position of the mammy, the domestic worker on the plantation. But it should be very clear that although she would grow to often care for the children that were at her, who were in her care, it was a job to care for her children, for the children of the white plantation owner. She often had children of her own that she had to relegate to being raised by someone else. There's a store in town here called Other Mother. I love that store. When I was a stay-at-home mom, look, if it was free in Albuquerque, I knew. If there was a discount, I was all over it. And Other Mother, I thought was very interesting, that term that was used, because other mothering would be very, very prominent once we get to Jim Crow era in the North, on these women who would take their children to the North but would send them back south in the summers because of childcare issues when school was closed. It would start because of what was happening on the plantations, because I am here to care for my children today, but I do not know my status as of tomorrow. And I need to know that if I'm taken away from this place, that there are other people in this place who can step in and raise my child when I'm not able to. When my grandmother passed and her 9 siblings who are still alive went to the service, they remembered not just Big Sister, but basically Little Mama. Because their mother was in the plantation fields, it was my grandmother who combed their hair, who prepared the meals, who would help do a number of things. And so their oldest sister would serve as the mother who took their space. My grandmother, when she was an only child, before all those children had been born, had been sent to go stay with her great-great-grandmother to care for her, because her parents were in the field. So this is not a brand new thing. This is a pretty old kind of relationship, and this is what many of those early mammies would be required to do. Once we got to Jim Crow era, though, this is when what was happening in the North that would become so very important. This is when we would switch to this industrial era America. Now, what becomes really exciting to me about this is because this is my area of research, the Social Security Act of 1935, yay! Few people get excited about kinship care and Title IV waivers and all the things of that nature. But when Social Security came about, it would change the nation. I mean, it would be because of Social Security that we would get, oh, you're in this field, Dr. Simpson. I mean, we would have this is the only way we've gotten our elder community to rise out of poverty, was because of Social Security. Now, there's all manner of things to play with today because of the companies that stole 401ks and pensions, and because of the lack of American savings, that Social Security serves as the only reason that people are not on dog food. because there's that little bit of resources coming. But when they were crafting that law, when that law would change the trajectory of the United States, they purposefully left out two working populations in the United States. Does anyone know what those two populations that were purposefully written out of being able to contribute to and receive Social Security? Domestic workers and migrant workers. Mid-1930s, they said, who works in America but doesn't deserve to contribute into the American economy? Why? Why do you think that was? So I can underpay you, I can pay under the table, that this can be this private hidden economy. I love it when they talk about hidden American economies, and it always goes to drugs and prostitution, but people that are working a job, or more importantly, employers who don't want to pay them a fair wage for fair work, are able to create this under economy. So when the Social Security Act would be crafted to keep those populations out, who were the number one people that were being kept out? Black women, who were primary domestic workers around the nation, and Hispanic men, who were primarily the migrant workers across the nation. That becomes super interesting today, because if you look at who works, how many hours they work, and what it looks like, we're going to see that white men earn the most, white women second, and then down the line. But the lowest income will be Hispanic men. But if you parallel that to the chart that shows who works the most hours, it is those Hispanic men. They make the least and work the most hours. This goes back to that Social Security Act that made sure that that population would never be able to economically contribute to and receive the benefits of time and accumulation of wealth and what it looks like. So the big thing that will happen once these industrial jobs will open up will be, it's a huge impact. It will be a huge change to be able to move out of the fields, to be able to move out of domestic work and into the factories. Because if I can earn $3 a day at a factory, that's a lot more than my $1 a day as a domestic. And so people will flee the South to the North. This is that part of that great migration you'll hear about, but we'll still, once again, like I said, see those families that will still send their children back south or down home. If anybody does anybody here have a down home? We're going back down home. We'll still return for that kind of care. At the same time, though, this is when there will be a rise of European immigration. Remember, we've closed down all the immigration borders. It was funny, most of the immigration laws will be exciting during this time, because at the same time all this is happening, we're defining who gets to be a citizen. And basically, here are your options during the 1930s. If you want to be a citizen, you either have to be white or black. Those are your only choices. So the Japanese and Asians are going to have a real conundrum. The Hispanic population will go with white because they'll have legal treaties from the Treaty of Hidalgo, Guadalupe to play with. And there wasn't a whole lot of immigration coming from Africa, because they were like, yeah, we're not. We've heard what happened on that cruise ship. We're going to do a different path. But there will be a rise of European immigration coming, with European women who will be taking all of those same menial jobs. And so black women will have to work for even less pay. How many of you have ever been in a place where you've seen gentlemen that hang out on a corner and basically people just pull up in a pickup truck and say, I need 3 guys to work on my roof, and 3 guys get in the car and they head off? Well, that's what it was like for black women. They would get up every day, they would get dressed, they would go stand on a corner and wait for someone to come and say, I need someone to come clean my house today. And you get in that woman's car and you go, or you go travel with her and you go clean her house for that day. Those opportunities and those positions are going to start to diminish because of, well, actually because of a lot of things that are going to change. That clip of Medea talking about the home for basically the assisted living facility, that's going to become the norm. We're going to stop putting grandma on the couch or on the bed in the front room, and we're going to start to find her a different place to live. At the same time, there'll be this magical, wonderful creation called the dishwasher, which for some reason in my kitchen doesn't get cleaned any faster, but we've got a dishwasher. There'll be this rise of technology. There'll be this thing called the iron that plugs in. There'll be these other kind of things that will diminish the amount of time it takes to clean my home. We're going to have many of these white women entering the workforce at the very lowest levels, and we're going to start to see just the inklings in the rise of child care facilities. These are all things that typically fell under the domestic's work, and because she would leave those jobs, the positions would generally change. And so we're going to get to, and I forgot, oh, so sorry. Yeah, it's, the Civil Rights Movement, where it's going to be super fun. And so now the Civil Rights Movement is when the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 will pop up. And we're going to start to see this really intense struggle. I mean, at the time that that JFK is going to sign the first Equal Pay Act, now I hate to say that, didn't we just see that on the State of the Union, a quest for an Equal Pay Act? John F. Kennedy signed an Equal Pay Act. And what's funny is that year that the Equal Pay Act was signed was the same year that the Feminine Mystique book was written. How many of you ever heard of Feminine Mystique? Basically, it was this idea that women, middle-class white women were born in suburbia and were seeking sanction to work at meaningful jobs outside the home. Now, you know, this is where it gets to be very challenging, because while many of these suburban white women were sitting in their chairs at home reading this book saying, I wish I could go to work, there was a woman scrubbing her floor. Now that's going to be a hard thing to grapple with. I mean, how do I sit there and say, oh, if only I could get out of here? They're thinking, me too. There's a lot of stuff to do. And so this is going to be a real struggle and a real problem in the economy, because the quest that white women were after was not the same quest of black women. In fact, after slavery, the number of women who would go and, you know, even in terms of sharecropping, the big goal was to be able to someday get to the owner of the plantation or the land and say, my husband says I don't have to work this no more. My husband's, and many times they would fire the husbands to force the wives back into work. They would terrorize the families because of losing access to those two employments. But this would become the definition of being a real woman. A real woman doesn't have to work. Well, this is going to branch from, if you ever, take a look at some of those segregated South signs and the things that were in place. And one of the ones that always catches my eyes is the one that reads, white ladies, colored women. What's written into those two terms? How is that, what stands out from there? Well, one is a lady. And that comes with all the connotations of being a lady, of being delicate, soft, helpless, modest, but a woman. Well, you can treat a woman any old way. That falls into a different category. And at the same time that white women are struggling with this categorization that they've been put into, this true Victorian nature from that, the 20s and the 30s, black women are struggling with this, you're not ever quite female enough. And we'll fight through that. By the time we get to the Civil Rights Act, or the Civil Rights Movement, this will be very, very hard in terms of grappling with a shared conversation on what we as women need. Because these were two very, very distinct, different needs. That's why when the conversation narrowed down to access to abortion, they began to lose a lot of people of color, because that was not the totality of reproductive right issues. The black community, black women were struggling with involuntary sterilization. You go in to have a baby and they manage to tie your tubes. Sometimes telling you, sometimes not. You get arrested and they argue you shouldn't be ever able to have children. They were dealing with the life circumstances that were causing women to abort their children. They were dealing with the ramifications of not having enough money to care for children. That is very different than just saying I should have the right to do this. They wanted a richer, deeper, more in-depth conversation. So by the time we get to, am I okay with time? I'm almost, shoot, all right, we're okay. I started thinking about what happens next, right? We have this very major change happening, and I told you about my grandmother who would come to the United States and would have this entrepreneurial spirit. She would basically begin her own lending industry and was an absolutely fantastic mathematician. My grandmother was born probably 22 years too late. She was the most dynamic woman I've ever met. She would teach herself to read the stock markets and would begin to invest her family's resources in CDs and stocks and bonds, and would begin this different thing. She would have a number of things happening. She always wanted to be a doctor, so I'm excited to be here to, not one of her grandchildren went anywhere near it. We've all avoided it at all costs. She has a lot of other ones. She's like, still no doctors. I'm like, oh, Grandma, you got a lawyer in the gig. Is that close? No, it's not good enough. But really, she would then go on to have my mother, who would be in a very different place. My mother would end up coming of age in the 60s and 70s, and she happened to be good at math. In fact, she happened to be great at math. Now, It's one thing just to be good at math as a human. It's a whole other thing to be good at math at a time when this little contraption, or at that time, room-filled size contraption called a computer was coming about. And so by the time my mother's math skills were known through high school, she would get she would go to her local college because she was a New Yorker. She would go through the New York system, would get an undergrad in computer science in '74. This is a time when few women were even in college spaces, but because of the construction of where she was. She would then go on through Bell Laboratories. If anybody knows the Bell Lab system, that was the standard bearer of technology in the Northeast. And there you got this little bit of pressure called antitrust violations, because Ma Bell wasn't allowed to be Ma Bell. She was supposed to be lots of little bells. So if you want to have a lot of fun, study what happened to the Bell system and what it's become today. Because of monopoly violations. But they realized that as we were dealing with all these kind of things, these companies were getting pressure for their lack of diversity. And so my mother would come of age at a time when Bell Labs said, we have got this program called OAC where we take people who we think will be really good, particularly minorities, and we pay for them to go spend a year in graduate school, all expenses paid, and a job at the end of the day. My father, being in the South, would journey to Southern University, where he would receive, which is a historically black university, and would get his degree there, and would also be picked up by the Bell Labs system. That's how we got to Indiana. That's where I jumped into Jersey. And they would start a very different economic trajectory for our family because of this outside intervention. My mom's mom had an 8th grade education. My dad's mom had a 5th grade education. These were women without a lot of access to means and resources who would go on a very, very different path. Now, the journey for black women in the workforce today is not easy. What you saw of Omarosa are the nicest set of clips I've seen because of that show. They take our conversation to be confrontation. Is that right, head of HR? Does that sometimes occur? This idea that I'm just trying to let you know these are the issues at play comes off as I didn't feel safe around her. We saw that in that little clip with Omarosa, who seemed, and watching it in retrospect, I'm like, she was just kind of just like, calm down. I'm going to speak in a monotonous voice, and you can't be afraid of me. I'm not afraid of you, I'll do anything. And her friend came running to her defense. Don't you worry. With 2 of us, she can't take us both down. And so these are things that will rise up, and we won't hear them called anymore of being the Mammy or the Jezebel or the Sapphire. We won't hear those terms. We'll just hear, doesn't seem to get along with her colleagues. Doesn't seem to really be connecting. Want to leave you with a couple of good stories. How many of you remember in Shreveport, Louisiana, there was a ABC network where there was one of the newscasters had gone down to her natural hair. It was probably maybe an inch or 2 in length. And as you can imagine, people began writing posts on the internet. Your hair doesn't look right. You look ugly. You need to do something about your hair. And so she went on the airwaves in a perfectly reasonable tone, explained, this is my hair, this is who I was born with. I find it really nice to be able to wear my hair in the workplace, and she was fired. Because she had a clause that says you're not allowed to respond to viewer comments or emails that you receive on air. She received lots of comments. Someone had called in and said she showed a clip with too many children of color. And she just said the children were randomly selected. There was no quest to find lots of children of color, have a happy holidays. So there were a number of things that kind of popped up, and she thought, hey, what a great place to explain this choice I've made. Now, how does that compare to the woman in, sorry, let me make sure I get where she was, Wisconsin, who was a plus-size woman who responded to an email she received by a fitness trainer who said, you're too obese to be on TV, you're a bad role model. And she got up there and said, hey, here's who I am, here's why it's great, here's why it's okay that I'm just like me, and everyone said, keep it up. Both ABC affiliates, both responding to attacks they were receiving. Does it matter one was in Wisconsin and one was in Louisiana? Does it matter that what they were advocating for and about were 2 distinctly different issues? Or is it something else deeper in there? A few years back, my grandmother, my Southern grandmother, had gone to church. She told me, I called her up, how are you doing? She passed some years ago. And she said, well, I left church early, and I couldn't understand. I was like, well, what happened? She's like, oh, they were doing a play. And the play they were portraying was about a domestic worker who, it was kind of a throwback play, if you will, but there was a young woman portraying being a domestic worker and the abuse she was taking from the white person she cleaned for. And my grandmother left, and I was like, she doesn't leave church. When you're head usher, when you're the mother of the church, you don't leave church. And I tried to understand what bothered her so much about that representation. And I remember my grandmother saying once that she had gone to the grocery store and the woman she used to clean house for was there. And I'm sorry, it was the woman she used to clean house for. And the woman, and my grandmother was so proud to tell me this. She said, nobody's ever cleaned her house as good as I did. No one has ever been able to clean it as good as I used to. Now my first response was, give me that woman's number and let me tell her about who needs to be cleaning her house and what it looks like. But I realized that for my grandmother, it was a workplace accolade. It was an indication of her work ethic, of what she was willing to sacrifice, of what she was willing to give, of what she was willing to put up with in order to do something different for the next generation. And she didn't go to her job begrudgingly. She didn't go to her job with an attitude or dismissiveness. She went there because she said, I'm going to do my very best here because this is not the trajectory for my family. And so when I thought about why she was offended about seeing that representation in her church, why she could smile at these people comment. I get excited when I get something published. We get excited when we get raises and promotions and bonuses. And although these were people that would not give her raises when they were due, who would put more work on her than was required, who would mistreat their relationship, she still knew that, just as Maya Angelou had said, she had done her due diligence because something was required of the next generation. I think I can give you, we can't leave without a little more Maya Angelou.
Many people wonder where my secret lies. I'm not cute or built to suit a fashion model size. When I start to tell them, they think I'm telling lies. I say, it's in the reach of my arms, the span of my hips, the stride of my step, the curl of my lips. I'm a woman, phenomenally. I walk into a room just as cool as you please, and to a man the fellows stand or fall down on their knees. Then they swarm around me, a hive of honeybees. I say, it's the fire in my eyes, the flash of my teeth, the swing in my waist, the joy in my feet. I'm a woman, phenomenally. Men themselves have wondered what they see in me. They try so much, but they can't touch my inner mystery. When I try to show them, they say they still can't see. I say, it's in the arch of my back, the sun of my smile, the ride of my breasts, the grace of my style. I'm a woman, phenomenally. Now you understand just why my head's not bowed. I don't shout or jump about or have to talk real loud. When you see me passing, it ought to make you proud. I say, it's in the click of my heels, the bend of my hair, the palms of my hands, the need for my care. Because I'm a woman, phenomenally, phenomenal woman, all you women and me.
I think we spend this time this month in Black History Month looking at so many of the things that are still yet to come. But there's nothing wrong, and it's ever so essential to remember where we've been, what we've been through, and what we've accomplished since then. Black women are at the bottom of the economic barrel in this country, but that does not define who we are or what we're preparing for the next generation. Thank you guys for hanging out.